Being a school counselor myself, I'm still seeing the effects of the pandemic on children. Many of them have difficulty socializing with their peers, and some of them even lack conversational skills. So, when I talk to parents, I often find myself discussing with them whether the child could still be experiencing the effects of the pandemic. So, this talk has definitely arrived in a timely manner. I'm really excited to learn together with everyone on the topic of COVID-19 related trauma on children and adolescents. So I'd like to warmly welcome our speaker, my dear colleague, Miss Michelle Quay, to join us. Michelle started out a professional journey as an engineering officer in the Air Force in 2001. Due to her interest in working with people, she became a volunteer counselor in the military. She went on to obtain a postgraduate qualification in Masters of Social Science with Edith Cowan University, and then embarked on a journey as a counselor. Michelle, along with many other trades, also completed another Masters of Science course with King's College London, specializing in psychology and neuroscience of mental health. For over a decade, Michelle has been working with adolescents and their families to address various psychological and interpersonal issues. In addition, as a parent coach, she runs regular parent groups throughout the year to support parents in their parenting journey. Michelle is a registered counselor since 2008 and clinical supervisor with Singapore Association of Counseling. Michelle, recently, as I found out, also has a very beautiful singing voice. So, as we move on with the talk, one last thing to note, just a quick heads up that we will be having a Q&A session at the end. While all participants are currently muted, you are encouraged to submit your questions on the Q&A function instead of the chat function. Michelle will try her best to answer as many questions as time permits. And now, without further ado, Michelle, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And it's really, really very nice to be able to join all of you in this session today. So let's go ahead with the slides. As you can see, it's a little bit anxiety provoking, even though I cannot see all of you in person, but still kind of scary, huh? Okay, so this is the slide that I have, the title slide. Okay. And it's really hard, I find, sometimes on Zoom to be able to interact with everybody because we can't really interact very well. So I do have a couple of polls that I will flesh out from time to time so we can actually have some level of participation. I thought, first off, it will be good to know who are my audience. So this is the first poll that I have. If all of you are on your computers, please go ahead and, oh, sorry, hang on. Wrong one. Let me just relaunch this. Okay, here you go. So this is to find out the profile of our participants here. You can indicate more than one option. Okay, all the roles that you have played during the pandemic. Okay, once we have most of us, then I will show everybody as well who we have online today. Okay, just give a moment. Okay, that's about 70-something%, maybe a little bit more. Okay, I think most of you have responded. So let me just end the poll and let's take a look at the results as well. Okay. Okay, so majority of you are obviously in the mental health profession, but I think we are not just wearing one hat. There are many roles that a lot of us play as well. And so if you take a look, there's a good number of you who are also parents of children and adolescents. I think this is why this particular topic is probably a little bit more interesting for you and you would like to be able to hear a little bit more and maybe share experiences as well. and a couple of others, healthcare workers, because that could be frontline workers as well as teachers and volunteers and so on. Okay, so this is where we are right now. Okay, so let me stop sharing this. Okay, and put this poll away. All right, so in terms of this topic, let's go on to the very first slide here. Okay, let's take a look at this quote about what is trauma. So I'll just read through and then we'll just break it down a little bit. It's an event, a series of events or set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Okay, it seems like a whole mouthful of words, but if we kind of like dissect it a little bit, okay, you can see that here an event, series of events and set of circumstances. Of course, for today's topic, we are referring particularly to the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, but if we think a bit more about this, it is not just about the pandemic itself, but the fact that it has gone on for a really long time. That's one. And also during different periods of time, there were changing restrictions, right, that all of us were imposed upon. And of course, the worst period of time was probably during the lockdown itself. And if you look at it, the restrictions were not just locally, but there was also the international kind of restrictions. So those times when we could travel, we couldn't travel, or there were changing, what you had to actually quarantine for certain periods of time and all that, right? So there's a whole lot of these things, which obviously was very traumatizing. And then over here, talking about physically or emotionally harmful, I think if you are working on the front lines, in the front lines as the healthcare workers, it's probably really, harmful, potentially harmful. But for the vast majority of us, I would say that because we may not necessarily be in touch with it as much, so it wouldn't be as harmful in that sense physically, but emotionally, there's a lot of impact on the rest of us. But then again, I think the other part that's really important to take a look at is the perceived threat. So over here, when you think about how threatening it is, we don't really know for sure unless you have actually had maybe a family member or a loved one being affected by COVID during the time before our vaccinations, then we will know how life-threatening it is. But for the rest of us, maybe we can only guess from whatever news reports and articles and so on. So I think the perceived threat sometimes can be a lot worse for the rest of us. And that's why it affects us in many different levels. So that's what we are going to expand a little bit more on. Okay, and then let's take a look at another part of it. We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past, but the imprint left by the experience on the mind, brain, and body. And this imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Trauma results in a fundamental or reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. So this is a relatively long passage, but there are also very, important parts that I would like to bring to mind here. I think this word here, imprints left by the experience. So, and the imprint is left on many different aspects, our mind, our brain, and our body as well. So as you are listening to this, I think it's really important to think about the context. Context is really important when we are working with the children and adolescents. And then the next thing I would like to highlight here is this part that talks about how the mind and the brain manage perceptions. So that also changes. If you think about what has been going on in the past 2.5 years, it has actually changed a lot of the way that we see things. You can imagine things like, for example, when somebody says, "Oh, I have a fever," immediately alarm bells ring. or things like somebody coughs, right? What does that mean, So the reactions that we get, it's not just about what happens in the brain, but also our physical reaction as well. We'll probably try to move away from the person, if we notice that the person has actually coughed or sneezed or whatever, right? So then this particular last line too, if we think about, it changes not only how we think, what we think about. I think there's a lot of things that goes on in our minds too, and our capacity to think, which I will expand a little bit more on later on too. So this is one of the terms that I sort of came up with, when something happens to any of the clients that I see, then I'll think, oh, this sounds like the COVID effect. Okay, so if we think a little bit more about our own experience, I think we need to start there as well. What's going on here? Because as much as the topic is really about the impact on the children and adolescents, I think there is a huge impact on us as well, the caregivers and the mental health professionals and so on. So basic things like altered daily routines, sense of uncertainty, social isolation, loneliness, stress, anxiety, fear, sadness, bodily discomfort for some of us, information overload, financial pressures, relationship issues, and sleep difficulties. So this is when I will need you to also respond to a particular poll, okay? And I realized after we created the poll that I'm kind of missed out one part of it, but let's go with it anyway. One particular question that I missed out, but I think we should still get pretty decent responses. Okay, so the poll is on, okay? Please indicate all the effects okay? This is for you experienced during the pandemic. You can answer more than one. Okay, just a little bit more. Okay, I think we have most of the responses. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Okay, I'll end the poll now. Okay. And let's share the results. Okay, let's take a look. So in ranking order, the majority of you have altered daily routines. I guess this is really quite natural for all of us, because during that time, there were a lot of things that we had to change, how we function, how we operate, whether we go to work in a certain way or do we work from home and so on. And then sense of uncertainty, that's really high as well. Information overload, look at that. So that's also a huge number of us. And then next one, stress, naturally. Okay, what do we have next? Social isolation and loneliness. So have a think about that. If a good number of us are experiencing that, not feeling somewhat connected, or maybe less of that, so that makes it a little bit more challenging. And some of the others as well, which is not very uncommon. So the reason why I wanted us to also reflect on this is think about how it may have affected us as we are interacting with different people, whether is it with our fellow colleagues, our loved ones, or the people that we worked with. So that's going to have quite a big impact on that. And of course, similarly, there is also an impact for the people that we are working with, for the children and adolescents. And of course, if we're working with different age groups of people, that's going to have an impact too. So what I was, hoping to be able to do with this part was actually to just remind us that the pandemic affected all of us, not just the children and adolescents, even though this particular topic is focused on that. So it's really intertwined how the impact is, I guess, affecting everybody at large. Okay, so living in pandemic times, the first two parts here about widening social divide and then the issues of the pre-existing inequities. I think this is what I was, thinking about in terms of personally. I guess I was really quite lucky in that sense, because there are certain things which I was still not really as inconvenienced as maybe certain parts of the other communities. In peacetime, when things are actually all going well, we may not necessarily realize this as much. But during the pandemic, I think it became a lot clearer about that particular divide. And that's a little bit of, I think, more sensitive to a lot of you who work with maybe the communities on the ground, or if you are in a school setting, and there's different economic levels of the students, that makes it a lot more challenging. I'm not really sure in terms of how some of the students amongst themselves, their interactions may be quite different to whether they are able to maybe understand or have some level of empathy and compassion towards those who may not necessarily have what they have, right? So some of the different aspects that I think were a little bit more alarming were things like, even like in schools, right? We'll be talking about the use of computers for home-based learning. So home-based learning itself, maybe for the vast majority of us who do have computers, like, the reason why we can do this Zoom meeting is because you have a computer that has pretty good internet connection, but there are groups of people who may not necessarily have that. And that becomes really very difficult because can they access the material, the education material? And if they can't, or if there's some constraints there, then it means that their learning will be impacted. That's something for us to have a think about as well. What then happens there? Or if the connection is not that great, or the teacher may not necessarily understand that there are some challenges there, they may actually sometimes misunderstand that they have certain kinds of difficulties there and may not necessarily respond very well to them in a classroom setting. Okay, so that's something to consider, to think about in terms of working with our young people. And some of the other things which we did already talk about for the increased uncertainty, lack of control, helplessness, and feeling stuck. So these particular things keep coming up in some of the conversations that I've had with the students that I meet with, in terms of, they're feeling like, I can't control this, I can't do that. And my parents are telling me that I should be doing things in a certain way, or I cannot meet any of my friends. Or worse still, when we had the limitations of the numbers of 5 or 8, right? Then you have to decide which people you want to choose to hang out with because there's a limitation of those numbers. And feeling stuck is actually one of the problematic areas in terms of trauma. If you cannot feel like you have some sense of agency and control and to be able to get out of a situation, then you actually remain continuously traumatized. So feeling stuck is one of the worst situations in terms of a traumatic experience right here. Okay, then I think this is an important one to go through a little bit more, just to help us also understand what is going on in the brain. So let's start off with the amygdala. So for this part, those of us who are a little bit more familiar with what goes on in the brain will probably know that that's where we'll have the emotion regulation. And one of those examples they tend to have when they talk about this is actually how we look out for threats, right? So, and when we look out for threats, that triggers the fight, flight, or freeze response. And that's what the function is here. So there is a lot more activity going on in the amygdala. And what that means is that when we are always in this heightened state of anxiety of sorts or fear response, right? Then how are we thinking about what's going on? It's like the whole world is probably quite a scary place, right? And that's not necessarily a very helpful situation in terms of trying to manage that kind of anxiety or the fear response, because it's always getting triggered there. Because it's for that sense of safety and survival need, which is why it triggers that response in the brain. And the other part is that if there is a sense that there's potential threat, then that's also going to trigger a lot of that stress and anxiety in the brain, which means that if you look at what's going on for many of the children and adolescents, and actually even for us adults, right? There's a lot more reactivity, and we may have difficulties with responding to certain things, whatever that's thrown at us. Okay, so that's one part of it. Then let's go on to this other part, which is the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so you imagine if there's a lot of this anxiety that gets triggered and the fear response that gets triggered, naturally, we are going to have some problems with the attention and the concentration and the focus in our brain. And I'm thinking that if you are trying to get a child to pay attention in class, it's going to be a lot more challenging there because of that heightened sense of the fear response that comes over here. And so it's almost like, information overload in the brain. So it's very difficult to then focus the attention. And what I found is that many people then realize that maybe the children and adolescents seem to be having ADHD symptoms. Sometimes I feel that's a bit more like overdiagnosed, or maybe people just label it a lot more, whether it's self-diagnosed or just putting a label basically on a particular child. But it may not necessarily be related to ADHD at all, because it could be that it's a traumatic reaction in the brain, which is why they have these attention deficits there. Okay, so if supposing they have all these kind of difficulties that they are experiencing in the brain, unsurprisingly, we are probably going to see some problems with the learning and memory. Okay, so you imagine those times when they were doing a lot more of the home-based learning. I remember that the older children, especially, I think the teens who were, doing the exams in the exam years, O-levels, A-levels, or IB, it was actually a lot more difficult for them to focus during that time because there's so many things that's going on. And even though they don't seem to be doing much, I remember that in the school that I worked in, the exam boards, they reduced the amount of syllabus as well in order to help them cope a little bit better. So doesn't that say a little bit about what's going on? There's some recognition and acknowledgement that it's not going to be as easy for the students to manage the workload, and they need to reduce them. So these are all signs that there's some impact on what's going on during our lives at that time. Okay, so over here, in terms of the trauma impact, I wanted to just make a little bit of a distinction between trauma and PTSD. I think initially, when some people look at maybe this particular topic, immediately they'll be thinking, oh, does it mean that, if there's the pandemic, then we are all going to get PTSD? No, actually, there is a difference between these two. It doesn't mean that if you have traumatic reactions, traumatic experiences, you would develop PTSD. I would say it's almost like on a continuum. So, for example, somebody who's experiencing some level of anxiety. Anxiety is relatively, you can say that you can normalize it to a certain extent because we do experience some amount of anxiety from time to time. But how long does this anxiety sustain, and how serious it is, how the intensity, the frequency of it, and of course, if it gets to the point where it affects your functioning, then that's when perhaps you will get a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder. So how I would like to frame this is that there is this continuum between trauma and PTSD. Okay. And how it becomes a little bit more difficult really depends on whether we are able to process the experience or not. So you remember earlier on, I was talking about context is really important. So what I found is that sometimes what may happen is that a student may be talking about a particular experience. Like, for example, they will say, oh, the exams are coming, and so I'm getting really stressed, and I can't really cope. I think I'm getting burnout. So when you just hear this in isolation, you may think that, oh, okay, let's just give them some techniques about how to manage their time, and how to cope with the anxiety because of the exams. And maybe we'll talk to the teachers about reducing some of the workload so that they'll be able to catch up, or we'll look at their sleep, are they sleeping well, and so on and so forth. But are we asking the question also about how the pandemic actually affected them? Or previously, when they were having some examinations that's before the pandemic, whether they experienced something similar as well, that would be a point of curiosity. So I think it's important for us to think about what has been going on before the pandemic, and then what happened during the pandemic, and then what's happening now, right? So there's quite a few things that we need to be thinking about rather than to just go straight into trying to solve maybe the symptom of the problem, I would say. And so there's quite a number of them who realized that during the pandemic itself, there's a lot of difficulties that they've had already. Like, for example, the earlier slide about what was going on, what's happening in the brain, right? Things like concentration, they were already experiencing some level of difficulty there. And then perhaps some level of increased stress. And then the difficulties with interacting with their peers and so on. And all these rolled into one, I would say the earlier on thing about the COVID effect, right? So the COVID effect has to be taken into consideration as well when we think about what's going on with them. So I would say this part is reminding us how important it is to actually do a very thorough assessment of what's going on instead of just addressing the symptom of the problem. Okay, and then over here, interoceptive fear. So this one is talking more about what's happening in the body. So, fear reactions and so on. It's not just talking about what we are thinking inside our heads, but what are the sensations in the body that's actually signaling this danger or this threat. So it tends to come up a little bit more in the bodily sensations rather than in the head, if you realize how our fear and anxiety actually responds. Then another thing that I'm pretty sure many of you may have also experienced is this symptom, this phenomenon of a year of fog. Like when we look back at what was going on during the pandemic, it seems very fuzzy. We don't quite remember, what was going on, or it just seems like a blur. The whole year has just gone in a blur, or actually more than a year. The 2.5 years has just moved like that in a very strange kind of feeling. So there's a little bit of that, which probably clouds whatever that we remember, and we don't really remember very much. So that's also something that the students may actually be experiencing as well. And they may not necessarily be able to put a timeline to it as well. So for this one, vicarious traumatization, I'm actually referring to the fact that, we were actually getting a lot of information from news media. And if you think about it, it was just that bombarding here and there, right? Whether it's on TV or on the internet, a whole lot of it on the internet. There's a lot of news articles as well as video clips and social media as well. And many of our young people consume this information too. And this information is actually very triggering, I would say. So in that sense, this vicarious traumatization is coming from those aspects. So even if they may not necessarily be interacting with people directly, who may be experiencing some of the effects of COVID, but if they are actually consuming a lot of this news media, then they may actually experience some of this vicarious traumatization as well. So the collective trauma is what we were talking about earlier on, that I was kind of reminding us that this is not just about the young people who are experiencing it. Even the adults ourselves, caregivers, and mental health professionals are also experiencing it. It's when trauma goes viral, right? Everybody has some kind of impact too. So we think about what's going on for ourselves. I think that's an important part to examine. At the same time, I would say, because we can't like so-called try to first heal ourselves before we heal them. I think if we do that, then maybe nobody is really doing the work. It has to almost be done concurrently as well, which is why as a community, we probably need to be, a lot more supportive to one another, and that connections need to be there. If you remember earlier on when we had the poll that talked about the social isolation, there were quite a number of us who felt like during that period of time, there was that social isolation, which I think doesn't really help the situation, especially if you're mental health professionals, and feeling that disconnection can make it a lot more difficult to support our, one another, as well as those that we work with. Then, with regards to how our children and adolescents view the world, this one, I think, is the part that we may not necessarily realize the impact, of how bad it can be for them or how difficult it can be for them. Because when they look at the adults around, especially the parents, maybe, that should be the first point of contact, right? During that period of time, when they were looking at the parents, how difficult it was, because I'm pretty sure many of us who, are parents as well, the panic behind it, feeling very uncertain about what to do, and then we'll be also worried about a whole lot of different things, because it just changes the entire workflow at home, and everybody's stuck at home basically during that period of time. And then when we had to go out, then we had to worry about a whole lot of different things as well. So if the children are seeing that the parents are not necessarily coping very well, which I mean, it's hard to cope, right? If you think about what was going on then, through their lens in that kind of way, it can be a lot more scary sometimes for them, yeah, because we are not really coping, the adults are not coping. And plus, if they look at what's going on with their teachers, okay, I don't think that is that easy for the teachers too, as many of us would know, especially those of us who work in the school, because the teachers were also having a really hard time. It's not common for many of us to be teaching online, right? So there's a lot of learning there, and it happens so quickly as well. So in terms of preparation, it's not quite there. So there's a lot of adjustment as well. And some of them did also sometimes express a little bit here and there to the children and adolescents about how they may not necessarily be coping. So think about what the children may be feeling when they are looking at the adults, basically. The adults are not coping well. And if the adults are the ones that are supposed to keep the world safe and they are not coping, then what next, right? So that itself can be very difficult for them if you think about it. Then the connection with the social systems. At that time, it was a lot worse, of course, even though now things are maybe a little bit better, but not necessarily in all situations. So there's a lot of disconnection. We are not really able to have those interactions. Because one of my pet peeves, right, is that we often use the word social distancing at that time. And in fact, it's so hard to remind them that it's not really social distancing, it's physical distancing that we needed. But the social connections need to be even stronger. But if we use that term, right, then we keep thinking that we have to keep apart from each other. And by doing that, it makes the connections a lot weaker between the social groups. And if you think about the children and adolescents, that's what they need most during this period of time. It's a developmental stage where they find their sense of identity, sense of belonging. And we have taken that away from them, or maybe not been as creative about how we want to help them interact with one another. So there's a huge gap there as well during that period of time. I don't even know whether can we make up for that, right? Over time, as they grow a little bit older. I'm guessing that if we do some longitudinal studies at some point in time, we may see some impact there. So hopefully, over time, we will be able to try to mitigate some of these factors and not let it, continue to be a permanent thing, I would say. Okay. And then intergenerational transmission of trauma, which from those of us who have seen what happens over time, it's still a question mark as well at this point in terms of what the effect is with COVID. But if we look at, previous maybe research papers of those other types of traumatic reactions, right? What the impact is across generations, we would probably see that. So we can only guess at this point what may happen in terms of maybe the way that they respond to certain threats, certain fear response, or how the social kind of interactions may have changed over time. So limiting some of that. So basically, I don't really know as well. So time will tell, I guess. Yeah. So this is just giving a little bit of an input on what may possibly be the case. Of course, it really depends from child to child, and some of them may have more difficulties. It's just reminding us that there may be different responses depending on the age of the child, and it could be the maturity of the child and also the family setting as well. Then prolonged living in this persistent trauma also reduces the capacity to inhibit impulses, make reasoned decisions, regulate emotions and behavior. This is also expanding on what we were talking about earlier on as well. So if we think about how they are actually responding, perhaps we may need to go a few steps back and go back to a little bit of the basics. So for some of them, maybe they are not as able or the capacity to deal with some of these emotion regulations may have been affected for some. So we need to go back a little bit to actually strengthen some of these skill sets. Okay, so how the trauma shows up. What I have in the next couple of slides will show the symptoms amongst the children and adolescents as well. So it may not always, it may not be all of these, so it could be some of it. So as I'm going through the different aspects, do have a think about what's going on with the children and adolescents that you work with as well. Okay, so decreased physical activity, more screen time. I think more screen time is the one that comes up quite a bit, especially when I talk to the parents. Irregular sleep patterns, and then less appropriate diets, onset of mental health issues. That's what I've definitely seen a lot more in the school setting. So a lot more of the students have the anxiety and depressive symptoms. Lack ability to self-regulate. Earlier on, we did talk a little bit more about that as well. And the impulse control, hyperactivity, being fidgety. Challenges with the executive functioning. So they may not necessarily find it so easy to do planning, time management, decision making, and so on. Difficulty focusing, forgetfulness. Social challenges is a really common one that comes up quite a bit. The increased challenge absences, I'm not sure how much do you actually see, but over at my end, we see quite a bit of that. So in the past, maybe we didn't have as many of the students being, I guess, absent from school. But during the pandemic and post-pandemic, there were a little bit more of those students as well. Some of them who didn't want to go back to school for a whole range of different reasons. A good number of them who did go back to school, then they reported social anxiety kind of issues. So not surprising at all. So a few of them may have taken some time to be able to get through that, but not all of them. attention seeking, internalizing and externalizing behaviors. So this, the behavior issues tends to come up a little bit more, oppositional behaviors as well. So as I'm going through these different ones, right, I have another poll that I will show up, okay? The third one here. Okay, so what are the issues experienced by the children and adolescents you interacted with? You can choose more than one response. So think about the different clientele that you've been working with. What were the things you saw? You can also indicate maybe your own children and adolescents if you do have them yourself as well. Okay, just a little bit more. Okay, a good number of you have responded, so I shall end the poll. Okay, let's take a look at the responses. Okay. Okay, the one that is the more screen time, that's definitely the one that many of the parents have been complaining about, that many of their children were actually using the computer a lot more, and that can be really problematic. Okay, and then we have irregular sleep patterns that comes up quite a bit too, and decreased physical activity, increased anxiety and depression. So it looks like you have also seen something that's quite similar at my end as well. Then self-regulation is a bit more difficult too. Okay, maybe not so many of you saw the increased absences, problematic behaviors that comes up as well. Okay, so bear some of these in mind in terms of what you actually see, the symptoms. And you recall earlier on, I was talking about how important it is to think about context, right? So as much as maybe some of it is related to them being children or them being adolescents, but in addition, we need to also assess and think about how much of it may be related to what was going on during the pandemic in terms of their coping mechanisms or lack of, or perhaps even reduced ability to cope during that time. Okay, so that's that. This is not like, okay, read all these books and then that's it, right? You'll be able to do everything. I don't think so. I think that there's a lot more learning that we will probably have to do. But I think it's good to have a think about some of the resources that we can go to in terms of trying to understand certain things, because I think this topic is really very big as well. And so it'll be really hard for us to just cover everything during this time and we can keep talking about it. So many of you will probably be familiar with this book, The Body Keeps the Score. So if you're familiar with trauma, this is really a go-to book, understanding a lot more about what goes on with trauma and how the body actually sends you a lot of signals, and it tells you a lot that you have to read in between the lines. So that's what I think about as well. Trauma doesn't just happen in the head as in analyzing it. I don't think that many of us are able to articulate what may be going on, but our body actually tells a lot, something's going wrong, something like that, right? And then the other one that I found really interesting also is this particular book that asks, what happened to you? So we may sometimes have a tendency of taking a look at a child's behavior or an adolescent's behavior and say, what's wrong with you? So the way that we approach it, needs to be a little bit different. And then we will be asking in a very curious fashion about what happened to you. So having the COVID lens, in place and thinking about context as well, again, right? context, what's going on. So what happened to you? It's a really important question to be asking in order to understand a little bit better about how to support the children and adolescents that we work with. Then, of course, this one is about mindfulness. So I think many people are now a little bit more familiar with how effective, how useful mindfulness is. Mindfulness is actually really useful in trying to help us with the traumatic reactions. So that's something to have a think about. I put this very non-counseling related book here, Atomic Habits. The reason why I think this is actually really something like that is useful, not necessarily this book specifically, but anything to do with thinking about how can we maybe do something about our habits. Because if there's a certain way of doing things that we are so used to during the pandemic, especially the one that parents will be complaining about the children using too much of their screens, right? So looks like in order to be able to maybe reverse that or to tweak that or to change that, we need to have new ways of doing things, new habits. So having some kind of resources in place would be really helpful. And this is just one of them. I'm pretty sure that there's a whole lot of other resources in terms of that. Okay, so let's take a look at what I think is the way to actually try to help ourselves through any traumatic kind of experience, which is what all of us are trying to get out of this pandemic, which will be to think about our connections, social connections with one another. Now, typically when something happens in collective trauma, so when an entire community is experiencing something, we think about, those other types of maybe disasters, for example, what actually happens is that everybody comes together. So only when you come together, you feel like somebody else understands what you're going through and you're able to support one another, help one another, comfort one another. I found that during the pandemic, we were lacking that. So there was a lot more of, because of the need to be apart physically, it made it a lot more challenging to come together. And that's why there's a lot of that gaps there in terms of whether we are able to reach out and support one another. It's very difficult. And I would say that even though we have some level of connection, like, now via Zoom, for example, it's really not the same as when we interact in person. And we couldn't do that for the longest time. So there's a huge gap in terms of how we're trying to make up for it. But we have to think about what actually happens. We are didn't have that opportunity to come together for the longest time. Okay. Now, in terms of being a lot more structured in the approach and thinking about what we can actually do. This particular model here, I think, would be very useful for those who are actually working in a school setting. So hopefully you will be able to try to work with that. If you're not necessarily working in the school setting, then I will have the next slide that will probably be a little bit more useful. But think about the structure within the school. I would say that these interventions should be based on these 5 principles here: safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment. So if you look at safety, for example, thinking about whether the children, do they have any spaces, that they can feel safe in? So within the school setting, is there a place that the children can go to? Or if it's, let's say, the counseling room, then do they have that sense of safety within that place? And other places that they go to as well, whether it's at the classrooms and other shared spaces too. So have a think about that. Whether do you have that influence in terms of making that space really safe, the common areas especially. And then the next thing, which I think is really important, is about choice. Because if everything is being dictated, they are told, okay, you have to do this in a certain way, and there's that top-down approach, right? There isn't really a choice. You can't really speak up, you can't really say anything. Then that also limits their ability to actually feel some sense of control. So perhaps if there is a possibility of thinking a little bit out of the box of, how can we then try to give them that kind of choice and control? I would say the choice and collaboration comes somewhat together to a certain extent. Of course, this must be age appropriate as well, because if they are younger, then we'll probably have to come in a little bit more and give them some, the choices will be a little bit more limited, but there's still a possibility for them to be involved in some kind of way. But if they are a little bit older, especially the teenagers, younger teens as well as older teens, then I would say this is a much bigger thing that we need to explore. Are we able to collaborate with them so that they can feel that sense of choice and control as well? So in the school setting, it's actually possible to do so, but whether are we open to this possibility? And then trustworthiness, okay? Are we, as the adults then, whether you're the teachers or the counselors, are we able to create some of these boundaries in a respectful way and maintaining them? So there's that mutual trust and understanding between the student and yourself, okay, and the adults in the school setting. Then, of course, finally, the empowerment. I would say that this is one of the biggest ones in terms of what kind of environment and what kind of atmosphere are we then setting out for the students? Are they able to feel like, they have a voice, they can be heard? Can they be affirmed? Are they being validated? How is the interaction with them? So we can play those parts, and perhaps we can have these conversations also with the other educators who are within the school environment. So that's the role that I think counselors probably need to play a little bit more in the school setting. If you are not necessarily working in the school setting, then of course, is having the trauma-informed approach then. So not very different from the earlier one, okay? But if we break it down a little bit, we think about the safe and supportive relationships. And this relationships is not just between the counselor and the student, the child, but I think that is also helping them then expand that network a little bit more. So expanding the connections to then include things like peers. Let's take a look at how they interact with their peers, and then how do they interact with the adults in their life. And of course, ideally, we want them to have strong connections and relationships with their parents, and then in the school setting with their teachers and anybody else, that they would be interacting with, so that they can develop that sense of belonging, and the sense of togetherness, basically. So you remember that earlier slide about how we heal from trauma is really about the community that we establish, so that we don't feel we are alone. So that's the part that we probably need to play a little bit more in terms of trying to help them create that safe and supportive relationships first and foremost. And then the next one is structure and stability, because when this traumatic kind of event, not really event, this period of time, has been going on for so long, it really messes up things a lot, in terms of how we deal with our life and so on. And so when that shakes up, we need to find some way of piecing that together again, or rebuild some of that, so that there will be some level of structure and stability. And when we feel that, actually it also helps the children manage some level of stability, feeling some sense of control, which I think is really important for them. So are we able to support them in terms of finding that? Which means you probably need to work also really closely with the adults in their life, because that influences what's going on in terms of that structure and stability. If supposing the family environment is not quite the best because of whatever conflicts that may be going on, it actually adds to the traumatic experience for them. So that's where you probably need to come in terms of trying to create more of that stability and the structure for them. Then shared agency is similar to the earlier slide that talks about the empowerment, and also some level of the collaboration and choice that we want to be able to work with, whether it's the children or the adolescents, so that they can have a think about where are the areas that I can have a say, have a choice, have some sense of control. It may seem that a lot of things they don't have that control, which is true, but I think in smaller areas, there are still things that they can do that is within their capability as well. Like, for example, as simple, I mean, it really depends on what emotional state they are in or their coping mechanisms. Then if you need to start as small as things like, I would be thinking maybe getting ready for school, right? Their ability to get ready for school, that is some level of agency for themselves too. So there are a whole range of different things that they can start to work towards and then feel like they can do something about it. Which I think is important for us to think about. How much do we then feel like we need to give them tools and tips and strategies? Actually, sometimes I feel that maybe we need to hold that back a little bit, as much as we may have our bag of tricks about what they can do in order to get out of a particular situation. But I think to a certain extent, it's more important for us to be asking certain questions so that they feel that they have come up with some things themselves, and to be able to think about what kind of inner resources that they have, rather than us dishing out everything to them. So have a think about that as well. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, I don't think that they have the ideas around it, or they probably don't have any resources. Maybe not. Okay. We may want to challenge that kind of perception a little bit and start really small, and then facilitate that process so that they will be able to find some of these inner resources that they do actually already have. And the next part is taking a look at the self-awareness and self-regulation. So self-awareness, what tends to happen is that we usually go into our head space and think about, oh, am I aware of some particular thing, you know? But then again, you know, earlier on in the slides, you know, I was talking about how a lot of it actually comes from the body experience, not necessarily from the head space. So if we're able to actually move down to the body space, and see what's going on inside, you know, what's going on in your chest area, what's going on in your gut, you know, are there any sensations that you feel in your body, and then get a sense of what this may mean. So sometimes it could be that not all of them will be able to articulate, especially if they are younger. So if you are working with the younger children, then you may need to use additional resources, whether is it in the arts or something that is like play therapy, using colors, for example, certain descriptors, objects, and so on. So I would not necessarily say that only the children may have difficulties with that. Sometimes some of the teenagers and adolescents may also have some difficulties there, depending on how well they maybe are aware of themselves or how well they articulate. So in some cases, you may also need a few other ways to be able to help them gain some level of self-awareness through a range of different ways there. Then we take a look at the self-regulation. Of course, that comes in many different forms. One of it is the mindfulness practice, which I think can be very useful in terms of regulating the emotion. And the one that's a little bit more common is probably the breathing, some of the breathing techniques, right? So the breathing techniques can also be very helpful to help them with that self-regulation. One of the other things that I think has been useful is actually teaching them grounding as well. So some level of grounding can help them with the self-regulation. So if you don't have any self-awareness, or you don't know where the triggers are coming from, or what's triggering what's happening to the body, then it's actually very difficult to figure out what you have to do in order to regulate. So they come together, I would say, the self-awareness and the self-regulation. And the last point I have here, social emotional learning, is about how we live together as a community. Because the one before that, self-awareness and self-regulation, is really about like myself, right? The child themselves, how they are actually able to deal with some of these difficulties and triggers. But then on the other hand, we want to talk about the connection that we have with one another. So that's where the social emotional learning comes in. Like developing some level of empathy. Do they know how to put themselves in somebody else's shoes? Some level of compassion. then they will be able to reach out to the other people around them, other children around them, to sense certain things, and reaching out to them, I guess, because you will notice that especially when they are children and adolescents, they are very sensitive to one another, and we want to keep building that as well, because when they're sensitive, what do they do about it? Do they then reach out, right? Reach out to one another, and that connection, building some of those connections are super important in terms of making sure that we heal from this traumatic experiences. Okay. I forgot to mention earlier on about the regulation bit. Besides that self-regulation, we should add the other one, that's co-regulation. So sometimes it could be that maybe there's some difficulty regulating on their own at first. So perhaps the adults around them, whether it's the parents or it could be the counselor yourselves, to actually teach them how to co-regulate. So that means you may need to, I guess, skill up the parents as well in those cases. And then when they are able to do that, then the child or the adolescents will probably be able to then start learning how to regulate themselves. So what this also means is that the adults ourselves also need to be able to show by example as well, how do we actually regulate our emotions? Because the different types of emotions that we feel, if we have some level of anger, some sadness or anxiety and so on, how do we actually regulate those emotions? So that's where we will be able to show our younger people what they can do when they are feeling a little bit overwhelmed, and they may need a space to actually regulate themselves, their emotions. Okay, so being trauma informed, this reiterating what we have talked about just now, right? So trauma is not just about the events, but about the child or adolescent's responses to them. So we want to be thinking about this responses, right? How was the experience? Remember, context is important when we're doing the assessment. So context is important. How were they experiencing it? And then what is it that maybe went well or didn't go well for them? And then what was going on in terms of the people around them? How were their friends responding? How were the adults around them responding? And when the adults responded in a certain way, how did they then feel about some of these responses? So some of these things, if it comes up, then that will be really helpful. And you remember that earlier book that was What Happened to You? So this is where we want to be thinking about reframing this particular thing. Now, sometimes parents may be saying, oh, my child is giving us a hard time, or that student is a problem kid or something. But perhaps, maybe we want to reframe that and say the child is having a hard time. So that gives a very different perspective when we are actually attending to a particular student or child. Instead of thinking that they are very problematic, then we start to have a little bit more compassion about what they may be going through. And this final part here about focusing on the strengths and deficits, because we tend to I think, focus on the negative instead of the positive, right? And so this is thinking about the inner resources that they may have, or what is already going well. What did they do in order to cope? Good. And maybe sometimes they cope well and sometimes they didn't. So we want to take a look at those times when they did and how to build on that. When did that happen? When were they able to cope? And then when did things kind of like fall apart a little bit? So I'm pretty sure that you will be able to find some kind of inner resilience and inner strength there and build from that. So even if it's not very big, we want to start somewhere and start with what they already have rather than what they do not have, some of those gaps, and to think about what has been helpful for them. And the final one that I have here, okay, so we have all the different aspects about what we can do as an individual, as a counselor, or as an educator or parent. But the other thing that hopefully we'll be able to influence is to think a little bit broadly about what's happening in the system. So what are the things, some of the systemic issues that's going on, maybe within the school setting, for example, if there are, okay? So having a think about what are the things we could potentially change? Is it the environment that needs to be changed? Is it certain mindsets that needs to be changed? And how can we potentially have some of these conversations in order to start effecting some of these changes? Because we cannot really do this alone and just, send all the children to see the counselors and then that's it. I think that many aspects, we need to look at it from a systemic point of view. So as much as we can work at the individual level, we need to also be able to then take a look at what else can we do within the system so that we are all on the same page. And I would really encourage everybody to work very closely with the parent community, with the educators in the school to be able to respond to these reactions. Okay, that's all for my slides. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Michelle, for talking about the concepts related to trauma. I learned very interesting terms today, such as vicarious traumatization. Actually, I've read the book, What Happened to You? I listened to the audiobook by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry, and it's quite inspiring to hear how a person who has undergone trauma views trauma using a scientific lens. So thank you for making the talk quite relational to us as well. So now we have come to the Q&A section, and thank you to everyone who has contributed to our collective learning. I'll just be reading out some questions from the floor for you, Michelle, and please feel free to answer them as we go along. So one person has asked, if a child is experiencing some of these symptoms that you have laid out in some of your slides, how do we know or differentiate if this is pandemic-specific trauma or some other trauma that was caused by perhaps, let's say, bullying or some other issues that are occurring within the school environment?
I think that we cannot look at it in isolation and just label it, this is what happens in the pandemic, is caused by the pandemic, and then this is primarily caused by bullying. I think we have to look at it as a whole. So I would say that we have to put all the different factors in it, almost like, when you're doing some kind of assessment, right? Let's say if there's no pandemic, okay, when we do an assessment in general, we actually will be looking at a whole range of different things, right? We will be seeing, oh, what are the family relationships like? Is there any mental health, issues within the family? What's happening in the school? What's the economic status? Do they have any friends? Have they experienced bullying before? Have they been traumatized before? And so on and so forth. So we would actually be piecing that picture together. And then after that, seeing what are the things that may make it a little bit more challenging for them at different stages, because I think at different ages, the impact of the traumatic reactions or any kind of experience is going to make a difference too. So we have to kind of like put it all together and then remember that because we have been in the pandemic for the 2.5 years, right? Then how has that really impacted them and at which stage as well? So everything needs to be put together in that sense. I don't think that you can see it in isolation at all. Not sure if that answered the question or not. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely see where you're coming from. No, I completely get where you're coming from, because if you think about some of the grade twos, they've not been having social connections for about 2 years now. So it's a completely different kind of normal for the younger kids. And you can't just take the pandemic as a sole factor, but you have to view it holistically with many other factors, just as you said. Are there any signs and symptoms that may mainly derive from the impacts of the pandemic in your experience?
Signs and symptoms that solely from the pandemic? I think it depends on the impact of it. So for example, I think in a normal situation, maybe the family wouldn't have any financial issues, for example, right? But because of job changes, then that would actually be solely because of the pandemic. That's why, a particular family may experience that. And when you experience some difficulties because of financial issues, for example, then it depends on what's going on in the family. Because if supposing it affects the parents in the sense that they are having a lot of anxiety about what happens next, are they able to support the family financially, and then it may create some tension within the family as well in terms of maybe the marital relationship, and that will of course impact the children. So it's a bit of a add-on, ripple on effect of what's going to happen next. There are some other things with regards to, I think, things like maybe during the lockdown effect, right? Looking at what happened with the social interactions, that's also quite a significant thing that has happened. They may have had, a ton of friends before, and then everybody would just be hanging out. And then what happens is that when they go back to school, they are not in the same bubble group as their friends, right? That is like horrors of all horrors that happens to the kids. And then they are stuck with some other groups of friends that they don't really want to hang out with. And unfortunately, because they can't really hang out with their other friends in the school setting like that, then they start to drift apart. So unfortunately, I mean, there are some of these things which are quite, I would say, uniquely pandemic.
Yeah. Completely agree.
Yeah, so there's a few
Yes.
things here and there.
Yes. The number of times kids have walked into my office just complaining about the people in their bubble group. It became a buzzword, around the school counseling environment. Bubble groups were talked about all the time. We have a request from someone for you to show up one of the slides is the how trauma shows up slide with specific, it's the second part of the 3 slides that you showed. Would it be possible to flash that for just a bit?
Okay, let me try. Is this showing up?
No, I'm actually seeing a white screen.
Oh, really? Let me try again. Hang on.
Sure.
Wait.
Yeah,
Do you see it?
perfect. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Perhaps it'll help the person who asked with something that they wanted to ask. So please have a look at the slide. The next question, Michelle, is that now that we are moving towards, easing up restrictions and kind of again going into another new normal, how do we manage the trauma of adjusting back to the old routines? Students are facing the challenge to even identify their own needs and wants. So again, it's kind of, I guess, what this member is trying to say is that how do we help them regulate their emotions with yet another change headed their way?
Mm. So I think it goes back to the skill sets that's probably important to work through with them. So you remember there's these 2 slides that I had, either within the school context, or if you're working with them not within the school context, right? Building those relationships, creating some level of safety, supportive relationships is probably a very important starting point. So if you think about the building blocks, what are the building blocks that are necessary? Relationships, to me, connections with one another, that's first and foremost. So if there are some gaps there, some anxieties, it really depends on what comes up. So if they are experiencing some level of anxiety about, oh, how do I then, reach out? Or who do I then reach out? Or my friends are awkward, I'm awkward too, So we may need to start building some of these skill sets, which like, oh, they should have known, right? But I guess with the gap, it actually makes a lot of difference there. So that's one part of it. Then the other parts will be with regards to that sense of agency, for example, whether they are able to then make some level of choices, have some level of control, and then some level of collaboration between, the adults and themselves about how to work through certain things. So we have to really keep reminding ourselves not to just give them the so-called answers or think that we have all the answers, because I don't think it's necessarily the case. So we want them to think about what is it that they managed to do during the pandemic. Because as much as we have all had very bad experiences or maybe less than positive experiences, actually, if we dig deeper, we reflect a little bit more, we might be able to find that there were some things here and there we managed to actually achieve or accomplish. And they may not necessarily, the young people may not always think about those things, because there's a tendency of just looking at all the bad stuff and seeing that, oh, everything was just bad. But when we ask some of these questions, then we'll be able to uncover that they were able to do some things on their own, or were able to find some creative ways of getting to something. I mean, one example is that some of them were a little bit more like resourceful, because if they are like, they have access to the internet, then they will be able to find maybe certain resources, or they even find some maybe exercise videos and so on and so forth. So there's a whole lot of different things that they actually have the ability to find resources to help themselves. And so we want to be building on some of these things in order to move forward with them. So I would say, go back to some of those slides that we had earlier on and review some of it as well. So we have the recording later on, so no worries, we can review that and then think through a little bit more about what are some of the steps that we can work through. Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle. Another attendee, I guess, has commented on something, and perhaps I could tie it with another question. So this person that they work with actually reported that their 6-year-old son started compulsively washing his hands and collecting soap as a result of the pandemic. I think, I guess, pre-pandemic, we kind of, as professionals, knew trauma on a scale exists, and we'll kind of assess and we'll kind of classify like mild, moderate, or severe trauma related behaviors are being shown in children. But post pandemic, like if you have behaviors like this, it's harder to assess these kinds of behaviors. Do you have any tips or suggestions on what counselors or even parents can do when a child of this age starts to exhibit behaviors like this?
I am not entirely sure about this particular situation, because I think a more maybe thorough kind of assessment needs to be done. If you can work collaboratively with maybe a psychiatrist or something to find out a little bit more about how much of this is could be, looks like OCD, may not necessarily be, or sometimes it's a response to some amount of anxiety or stress, which is what OCD is about anyway. So we want to also see about the severity of it, how bad is it, how do they understand it. And this thing about whenever something like that happens, there's a tendency of us to say, don't do it, stop doing it. And that doesn't really help, right? So perhaps we want to be able to facilitate that a little bit more, especially when they are younger child. They may not necessarily understand fully what's going on or be able to articulate it. So remember earlier on, we were talking about how may need to actually consider other ways of exploring finding ways for them to articulate what may be going on, either in terms of some art, play, art and play therapy or something, sand play therapy, also a whole range of other things. I think would be helpful for us to just get a sense of what may be going on. And if necessary, if it's really something that's affecting the daily life quite a bit, then we want to work collaboratively with maybe a psychiatrist to assess it a little bit more.
Thank you for your clarity on that, Michelle. Another question for you. What is your thought of the impact of wearing masks, because it's still happening now, on children and adolescents within the school and the social setting?
Mm, very funny question. Is this a government question? uh, um, I know that there are some people who sometimes feel like they want to continue wearing the mask so that they can just hide behind something, right? Uh, I mean, that says a lot, isn't it? It's also about what we are used to, what we're going to be comfortable with. And some people is like, no, no, take it away from me. I just want to feel very free from it and all. So I think it depends on really the individuals, and also sometimes the level of anxiety within a family setting, maybe, or the comfort level. So it's a whole range of different things. I don't even know like what's going to happen later on. Are they going to then say, okay, it's up to you. You can wear your mask or you don't want to wear your mask. I'm pretty sure that when that time comes, there will be a good number of people who will still continue to wear it, either because they are fearful that they will fall sick, that's the traumatic experience kind of thing that's coming up, right? So they want to continuously try to keep themselves safe. So that's what they are going to continue to do, even if, let's say, government at some point says you don't have to wear masks anymore. Or some of them may just say, oh, pollution, so I'll just wear my mask or something like that. Whole range of different reasons I'm pretty sure that they'll come up with. And some others will just do it because they don't really want to be want people to see their expression. Some people really like, there's a certain sense of safety. So I don't really have answers to that, but I think some of us would have seen some of these experiences amongst ourselves, the adults, as well as among the young people as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's a very easy answer to that question either. Even with young children, you see the impact. It could be negative, it could be positive. So I see where you're coming from. I think another question related to the pandemic is the increase of screen usage due to home-based learning. A lot of children have increased the amount of time that they have spent on screens because of the pandemic. Even after things opening up now, this still continues to be a main source of recreation for children and adolescents. Do you have any suggestions on how to gently wean them back off the devices, which I believe could take another 2 hours worth of strategies?
I think in the first place, right, many of us as adults, right, we need to ask ourselves, have we weaned ourselves off it? Yeah, because I think whether we like it or not, most of us have been really affected by it. Affected in the sense that it's harder to get ourselves out and about, actually. So this is not just a problem of the young people, but also the older people like ourselves, because it's so convenient to just go on screen, do everything there. You want to go shopping online, you want to go order food, so much easier to then, go grocery shopping in person or whatever, so even we adults are not necessarily very keen on it. And we would have seen actually a decreased physical activity even amongst the adults. So it's not just the kids. So first of all, I'm wondering whether the adults on this call, how much of that screen time are you using and how much physical activity? So if supposing you have some of these, I guess, positive way of interacting with the devices, right, then the children will probably follow suit as well. So that's one part. If you are having, a lot more, okay, you go out and meet friends, you go and do some physical activity or a range of different things, then we would have the younger generation also see us doing something like that as well. That's one, is by example, which I think plays a huge part, because if you're so used to it, whether it's at the dinner table and so on, we allowed it all to happen, then they are not going to be able to do otherwise. Then the other one is, you remember that's one of the books that I put out about the habits, right? So I think it's having to develop that new habits, whether first of all, are they aware that this is going on for them? So the awareness needs to come in, and then whether are they willing to do something that is different? Maybe initially not so, especially if, let's say, the schoolwork is not really hard, right? So they will have finished all their schoolwork and they want to spend the rest of their time on the screens. So that's like a really straightforward thing. But majority of them, as they go a little bit higher up in the educational level, and then they realize that if they use too much of the computer time to do a whole range of different things, then they're not going to get any studies done at all. Then that's when they are a little bit more motivated to change. So I think it also depends on the stages of their life too. Otherwise, there's no reason why they should change, right? They finished their homework anyway. Why wouldn't you allow them to play on the computer or use the computer? The other thing that I didn't quite mention during the presentation that I think is also important for us to take note of is, you remember about the information overload and also about the impact on the brain in terms of the attention span and learning and memory and so on. I think that there is a tendency of, especially during the pandemic time, that because there's just, I think, feeling overwhelmed in general. So we would have the tendency of just going to something like maybe social media or watching Netflix in order to just cope. We're just scrolling there mindlessly. It's a very passive activity. We don't have to use any brain power whatsoever. We don't have to go and engage in it. And we can just sit down there and just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling because we are already feeling very overwhelmed. So that's also a little bit of an effect of it as well. So then to pull ourselves out to actually engage in something, I'm not really sure, because let's see how it is when we have the in-person sessions. How many of us want to get out of, because now, right, Zoom is very easy. We just like click on it and we are on, right? But now we have to maybe dress up, look a little bit different, and then hi bye to everybody, take the public transport or whatever. So there's still some amount of resistance, I think, to just get out and about in terms of that. And it will be challenging for us. It will be so much easier to just sit there behind the screens and scroll, just click a button and so on. So it takes a little bit of that transition, and we need to be able to have some of these conversations to see what else is going on. If you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, then how are you going to cope with it and make some of those shifts along the way?
Thanks, Michelle. Some questions surrounding the emotional dysregulation that you talked about, the regulation and the co-regulation. Do you have any elaboration or some points to help parents on the management of self-harm behaviors due to the emotional dysregulation that could have been worsened by the pandemic?
Well, that's like a different topic altogether, right? Self-harm and co-regulation. Well, okay. I think helping parents may be a little bit more of a challenging thing. I hope that whoever who is experiencing it maybe work together with the counselor first. So taking a look at the assessment of what may be going on. Okay, so for example, what the triggers are. You remember earlier on, we were talking about the triggers. So developing that self-awareness is probably an important starting point for the child or the adolescent who is self-harming, right? What is going on for them? What are some of the things that may be triggering them that make them feel a little bit more overwhelmed? Because if we just say, oh, it's the pandemic, I think that that's too broad. It makes it very complex and maybe very difficult to actually pinpoint what it is. So asking a little bit more about what kind of emotions get triggered, when you think about something, or when this happens, or when you interact with somebody. I think one of the common ones that comes up is the social anxiety. That's what I've seen a little bit more. So if the social anxiety comes up, right, they may feel like it's very overwhelming, that maybe the peers around them may be judging them, or they may feel like they have said something wrong or did something that's bad, and then they need to hurt themselves in order to have some kind of relief. So it could be that, for example, so if they are able to then has some level of awareness to find out what was going on or what has been going on. Sometimes it may not be one thing, it could be a combination of different things. And that could be a starting point in terms of tracking it as well. And what we've also noticed for self-harm behavior, it need not only be one thing that triggers it. Sometimes, or most of the time, it is a series of different events or different things that happens, and then something tips it over, right? So we want to be able to take a look at not just about the incidences, but how it made us feel, something like that. So the responses to it. And then think about what other alternatives are there to this particular self-harm behavior. Because if they don't necessarily have good amount of coping strategies at this point in time, then of course they will keep self-harming because that's the way that they will be able to cope with whatever level of distress or feeling overwhelmed. So do they have other coping mechanisms? And that needs to also come from them in terms of what they are willing to try to do. So some small little things first, give it a try. Sometimes it could be that when they have some level of awareness of the urges that comes up, the urge to actually self-harm. They may not actually self-harm, but there's an urge. That's also an important point to take note of. What may come up as an urge? And then what do they do that has helped them not actually end up hurting themselves? So those are positive kind of things as well. So a whole range of different things. And then we take a look at where the parents come in, because the parents could be part of the triggering point too. So if there is, what is it that the parent may have said or may have done that may have made them feel bad? I think one of the common things is probably some level of guilt. So they feel some level of guilt towards what the parent has been able to, is trying to do to help them, for example, but they feel so lousy that they still hurt themselves and they feel really very horrible about it, that could actually just make things a lot worse. So we want to be able to have some level of like reassurance from the parents that it's okay, even if you hurt yourself, I'm still here with you, and then we will work through this together, rather than why do you do this again, so in terms of the responses, how the parent can respond a little bit better. So context of the pandemic, I think we want to take a look at what is it that may have made it worse for them because the pandemic has happened.
That's a very, very concise answer to a very complicated question. Thank you for that. I think another question or some questions related to regulation that have cropped up is to do with, sometimes children may come to a counselor and say that I am feeling depressed, or I am feeling very highly anxious, I am feeling very worried, but within the school environment or towards their parents or towards their friends, they completely show a different persona. They could appear to be very bubbly or outwardly friendly. How do you help, or do you have any tips or pointers on how to help our child or adolescents in this case?
So in terms of how they actually respond quite differently to maybe different groups of people, and so I think that's actually also kind of not very unusual thing that the child, especially the adolescents, they are going to have some different personas. So it depends whether how problematic the situation is as well. Because I think if they are not necessarily feeling very comfortable with it, then that's let's say a particular situation where they are a little bit more, I don't know, bubbly, outward looking, and very extroverted and so on, and they don't really like that part of them, then that's a little bit more problematic to address. So we want to take a look at that comfort level. But then again, we also need to address whether is it something that we are uncomfortable with, that they are behaving a little bit differently. So there are a few different things to be asking ourselves here about what is the problem here, really, something like that. And then assessing a little bit more about is what the child actually wants to be able to do differently because there is this difference that's being observed. So sometimes it could be that because they don't feel like it's very congruent and that doesn't make them feel good, then that's where we want to explore a little bit more. So what is it that you would like to do instead, and what are some of the barriers maybe preventing you from doing so, or what is it that's making you feel like you need to act out in a certain kind of way. So I think quite typically when somebody is a bit more like out there, out and about, it's almost like overcompensating, I think. And it's a bit of a question mark. What is it that makes them feel they need to overcompensate a little bit more, and do things a little bit differently so that maybe people will kind of like notice them? So in that sense, do they really need to do something like that so that everybody will respond in a certain way? Then we can address it from that perspective instead of saying, okay, you need to change a certain kind of behavior or attitude. Not really. I think we need to take a look at what really is going on and what is it that they would like and what doesn't sit well with them.
Thank you for that clarity. So let's have one more question, and then we slowly start rounding up our last talk for today. What about children who are wearing masks and who have trouble reading expressions of other people? How do you think this would impact their social learning, or sometimes even, I guess, academic learning? For a very long time, I think only recently in the news it was announced that they will be removing their mask for some language-based lessons. So please feel free to share your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard definitely a lot of this. I remember that, when all these pandemic things first started, there was one of the language teachers who quite deliberately got a mask that is like transparent and you can see it. And I think that was so useful because that's how you learn languages anyway, right? You look at the mouth shape as well, not just about the sound, and that's really very helpful. So if, let's say, they do have certain kinds of needs, because this question sounds a little bit more pertaining to children with specific kind of needs. Of course, some may not necessarily be very significant needs, but if they do have some needs, then we may want to consider whether are there any alternatives in terms of how you could make available some of these masks. And I think that there are anyway. So it's whether we are able to maybe obtain them a little bit more widely so we can use that more. Because I think the facial expressions are still really very necessary in terms of trying to read the cues, not just facial expressions, actually the entire body, how we actually position ourselves and our body language, and so on and so forth. So this is something that is not so straightforward to answer, because I think that it's quite similar to my last slide talking about some of the systemic kind of issues that we may want to consider. So now kind of like thinking forward, that there are certain needs sometimes when we're talking about children who may need this a little bit more, for example, even maybe those without needs, right? Without these specific needs, I think it's still helpful to be able to explore how to engage one another in the kind of environment to be still able to read the facial cues and so on. So yep, looks like another market area to consider then.
For sure. Thank you, Michelle, for handling all the tough questions. I know it must not have been easy on a Friday evening, sitting there and answering all these questions quite fast. So thank you again for enriching us with your talk.